You might know Mike Majlak as that guy from Impaulsive or Logan Paul's vlogs, the same guy who's dating Lana Rhoades and hosts The Night Shift. But what you might not know is his decade-long history of drug dealing, opioid addiction, and alcoholism.
How bad was it? As bad as it could get. As bad as it could get.
I keep it going, I'm rolling and flowing, I'm coasting, I got them all trolling me right. I just keep growing and showing them, knowing I'm owning this flow, you can catch me outside. Gonna get them all with a little payback. Never gonna fall, I'ma stay on the attack. Put them up against the wall as I finish every track. Never gonna stall, no, I'm never gonna slack. I've been like working and learning and searching for something to push my shit over the edge.
Mike was born in 1985 in beautiful Milford, Connecticut, then one of the top beach places in America. His parents loved him and were comfortably middle class. His father was a businessman and often talked of marketing and sales principles at family dinners. These talks would have a huge impact on Mike for the rest of his life. Mike was smart. He joined the gifted program and played sports, but despite the good grades, he was a constant distraction to the other students. He frequently made jokes and had outbursts in class. They thought he had ADHD, and his parents took him to a psychologist. Turns out, he didn't have trouble focusing, he just loved putting on a show. Unfortunately, things were about to take a turn for the worse for Mike. Statistics show almost half of all marriages in the US end in divorce. At the age of 15, Mike witnessed his parents split after 23 years of marriage. Suddenly, they no longer had enough money to afford private high school, and Mike transferred to a local public school named Foran. Foran was known as the rough party school. To give you an idea, during the first week of his freshman year, Mike was shoved up against a wall because he failed to call out "straight" when he walked in the bathroom. That was how people doing drugs in the stalls knew that it wasn't security coming in. Without a private school headmaster to crack the whip, Mike was quickly reinstated as class clown. Creating class disturbances and playing daily pranks were the fastest ways for Mike to make friends, with all the wrong people. He enjoyed the attention. He always wanted to cause a spectacle. The feeling of acceptance he got from people's reactions was a natural high. One of Mike's friends at Foran was an Irish kid named Kenny. Kenny also came from a broken family and often had a free house. His single mom worked long hours and the teenage boys quickly took advantage of their freedom. After school, they often went to Kenny's house, blasting Eminem and smoking street-grade marijuana. Little by little, their appetites for the drug grew. Random people stopped by Kenny's room day or night to drop off weed. They didn't know much about these strangers, who they were or where they came from, except that they dealt drugs. Mike started to develop an interest in the prices, weight, and money associated with dealing. The business aspect of weed attracted him because of the power the dealer had over his buyers. He would set the prices. He would determine where meets happened. He would make all the rules. Visualizing that kind of control lit a fire in his soul. It made up for all the other places in his life that were out of control. From the second Mike witnessed that lifestyle, he wanted it. Jared was one of the main weed suppliers in the area and was only a year older than Mike and his friends. One day, he paid a visit to Kenny's house. In the past, he'd noticed Mike's curiosity for dealing. This time, he asked Mike if he wanted to start selling. "When can I start?" Mike said. 5 minutes later, they were driving to Jared's house where he introduced Mike to the drug game. Over the next few months, Jared taught Mike everything he needed to know about selling drugs. He taught him how to balance a digital scale, how to bag up, where to meet people, and most importantly, how to behave around customers and connects. The first bag of weed Mike ever sold was to a freshman from Foran. Using upsell tactics, he secured $50 from a 9th grader who had only intended on spending $20. From then on, Mike used upsell tactics on everyone he met, even on close friends. He met students from Foran in parking lots or in their parents' homes. he became highly efficient at upselling customers and marketing himself. The game came naturally to him. His father's dinner time talks on business were beginning to bear fruit. At just 16 years old, Mike was now one of the youngest dealers in Milford and raking in hundreds of dollars per day. Over time, he'd built up an impressive customer base within the town and its surrounding cities. Selling drugs and partying consumed his life. He began to have less time to complete homework. His grades plummeted from a 3.3 to a 2.0, and he started getting into more trouble at school. During his junior year, Mike's drug sales continued to grow at a rapid pace. Eventually, he was approached by his supplier's supplier, a man named John. He said, "I just want you to know that you don't gotta go through Jared no more. Just call me, I got whatever you need." John had been Jared's supplier since Jared got his initial start. He was one of the big shots in Milford and brought in hundreds of pounds annually through connections in Canada and upstate New York. Mike accepted John's offer. Just like that, he jumped a rung on the ladder. Rap music had a huge influence on him. It was an exhilarating feeling to drive around Milford selling drugs while listening to Jay-Z or Biggie Smalls. Mike's lifestyle began to mirror their lyrics. At this point, he was moving pounds of weed at a time, and the stench was unbearable. Half of his energy was dedicated solely to hiding the smell from his mom. Through his ability to talk and build relationships, he had grown a massive customer list across multiple cities. With this expanded customer base came expanded opportunities on the supply side. Due to his youth and inability to put up the $3,200 needed to purchase a pound of weed to sell, the higher-ups started loaning Mike the product on credit. He would have to pay them back afterwards with sales made from the same product. In the middle of his junior year, Mike's connections received a major shipment from Canada of the notoriously pungent BC Bud, a strain named after the area where the weed was grown. They wrapped the Mary Jane in Ziploc after Ziploc, but it was no use. There was no masking the skunky aroma, no matter how hard they tried. When Mike arrived from school that day, he found his mom waiting for him in his room. She held up 2 giant bags of marijuana. "What is this?" she screamed. "You're selling drugs, aren't you?" Up until then, Mike's mom had only a vague notion that he was up to no good. She'd found stashes of money in his room and noticed his sets of new and expensive clothes. He often left at random times, sometimes during dinner, for no apparent reason. He'd rush out with a pound of weed just as the meatloaf came out of the oven, and then return with $4,000. With her discovery came an ultimatum. "I can either flush it," she said, "and you can stay, or you can have it back and leave the house today." Mike chose to leave. As much as he wanted to stay, he owed a lot of money for the product. The consequences for non-payment would be harsher than a few weeks on the street. He stayed at a friend's house for a week until his mom called and told him he could come back home as long as he stopped selling. He came home with the intention to do right by himself and his family. He informed his dealers that he was done selling. He told his friends he wouldn't get high anymore. But soon, those sentiments went out the window and he was right back in the drug game. After his mom went to sleep at 9, he would sneak out and make sales. It was exhilarating for Mike. Power, money, life on the edge. More than anything else, this was the high he was addicted to. The rest of his junior year was spent dealing, partying, and experimenting with new drugs, most notably mushrooms, LSD, and ecstasy. Except for the dealing, many of his peers at Foran followed suit. To them, this type of activity wasn't any different than past generations who'd experimented with LSD or Quaaludes. When a new and exciting pill hit the streets, it was inevitable that the young people of Milford wanted to experiment with that too. OxyContin, made by Purdue Pharma, was different from other drugs. Built for cancer patients who had to take multiple pills, OxyContin was manufactured with a timed release seal so that after taken orally, the drug would be released slowly into the bloodstream. Now the patient could take one pill in the morning and the powerful opioid would be slowly rationed into the blood. This time-release seal allowed Purdue Pharma to pack a highly concentrated amount of opioid painkiller into a single pill. The toxicity of these pills would normally be lethal to most users, but when placed behind a time-release seal, the flow to the blood was controlled, and the toxicity was therefore also controlled. For a short time, the pills did exactly what they were meant to do. But it wasn't long before people found a way to remove the time-release seal off the pill. By putting the pill in the mouth, a person could suck away at the seal until it faded away completely. Once the seal had been removed, people would crush the pills and sniff them for instantaneous delivery. Once finished, the painkillers morphed into a legal form of heroin for the general public. It was the spring of Mike's junior year when he first tried Oxy. His friend crushed an 80 milligram pill into dust and lined it on top of a CD case. He handed Mike a rolled up $20 bill to snort the powder. The high was instantaneous. Later on, the pill began to pop up in local parties on the weekends and was smuggled into study hall at school. Slowly, the use of all other drugs ground to a halt. Even those who had only tried weed transitioned to Oxy. The dealers began to notice the shift in demand and adapted. Mike's supplier, John, was no different. Now 17, Mike began selling OxyContin at $60 a pill and profiting $400 a day. It was at this time that Mike also started getting high off of his own supply. As his dealing increased, so did his use. Unfortunately, it took less than a year for users like Mike and his customers to form a dependency on the drugs. Now in his senior year of high school, Mike and his friends started to experience withdrawal symptoms when away from the pill for more than 24 hours. In just a few months, what started out as recreational drug use turned into a full-blown epidemic of dependence and addiction. At 17, Mike was addicted to narcotics. Every morning he awoke to pre-made lines that he'd constructed the night before, hidden in his sock drawer. By the time he was 18, Mike had to use Oxy multiple times a day to keep from experiencing withdrawal symptoms. On the day he graduated high school, he was a full-blown addict. When he walked on stage to receive his diploma, he was high. When he shook his principal's hand, he was high. Now, with no classes to attend and very little guidance in his life, Mike was free to drive around selling and sniffing pills. One day, he took a ride with John to see his supplier, Brett, in the next town over. Brett was the main supplier for Milford and its surrounding towns. If a narcotic was bought in Milford, chances were it came from him. After sending John away for some cigarettes, Brett spoke to Mike alone. "Listen," he said, "I know you're moving all the Oxys, and I know John is making all the money. Screw that. Call me directly from now on." As Mike's success in the drug game continued to rise, so did Milford's crime rate. In 2005, just 2 years after finishing high school, Mike's hometown of Milford had changed beyond recognition. What was once a beautiful beach town had been defaced by its own young people, who resorted to violence and crime to support their addiction. Purdue Pharma began to make its first attempts at recalling OxyContin, but the damage had already been done. In small-town Milford alone, there were hundreds of kids caught up in the active addiction. By 2006, Purdue Pharma began aggressively pulling OxyContin off pharmacy shelves. The kids in town began searching for a substitute, Vicodin, Roxycodone, and Percocets. For the original addicts, however, these pills were unworthy substitutes, not even strong enough to stave off withdrawal symptoms. There was space in Milford for a new drug of choice, something even more powerful than OxyContin, Geographically, Milford, a nice beach community, is close to two of the poorest and most dangerous cities in America, Bridgeport and New Haven. Oxy users in Milford usually never communicated with their inner city neighbors, but once the opioid was no longer accessible, the drug trade between Bridgeport, New Haven, and Milford was given life. A powerful opioid, OxyContin, was so potent and created such dependency that it made the transition to heroin extremely plausible. Since there was a new drug in town, plus dwindling supplies of Oxy, Mike saw a business opportunity. On a Tuesday afternoon, Mike drove to the rough part of Bridgeport to speak to a friend of a friend, a man named Uncle Nicky. Uncle Nicky was a short, pudgy Puerto Rican man. He was about 40 years old and 5'7", with a big dad-bod stomach and sometimes playful attitude. He lived on a one-way street in one of Bridgeport's toughest neighborhoods, called The Hollow. Eventually, Mike began to spend more time in the inner city at Uncle Nicky's. It was a place of urban despair, vastly different from Milford's middle-class suburbia. Finally, after the 5th time Mike met with Nicky, all the back and forth stopped. He walked in the door to see an even shorter Puerto Rican man standing next to Uncle Nicky. Whereas Nicky was a jolly, joking kind of fellow, this other man was not. Nicky introduced Mike to Loki, his supplier. Loki was a stocky, muscular bulldog with a close-cropped haircut. He emitted a vibe of pure cartel. During that meeting, Nicky and Loki proposed what would become a new operation. They would supply a mid-sized quantity of heroin that Mike would take back to Milford to sell to all the people who could no longer find Oxy. Before the meeting ended, however, Nicky and Loki wanted one more thing. They told Mike he should sample the product. As an addict, it didn't seem like much of a stretch for Mike, just a different colored line. Without hesitating, he tried his first line of heroin. For the next few months, Milford got familiar with their new drug of choice, thanks in no small part to Mike stealing. Business was booming, and at the age of 21, Mike decided to move to the north end of Bridgeport and stay with Uncle Nicky. Together, they turned Nicky's house into a one-stop drug market. Customers would show up at all hours of the day and night to buy cocaine and heroin. The house became a cash cow. As a dealer in Milford, he'd seen a few $1,000s pile up over the course of a week. But now, several $1,000s came in with each sale. Shockingly, there was never much profit at the end of the day. Whatever was sold was outweighed by the amount they sniffed. They were addicts selling to addicts. Things began to disintegrate further when Nicky started undercutting Mike behind his back. Within weeks, most of Mike's buyers had transitioned to buying directly from Nicky. But Nicky needed the extra cash. Unbeknownst to Mike, he had racked up $10,000 in debt over the course of 6 months. His supplier Loki was tired of waiting for payment. One day, while Mike sat in Nicky's bedroom, weighing and bagging coke, he caught sight of a man running through the front gate. Moments later, Loki crashed through the back door. He approached Nicky, his face twisted in rage, then whipped out a black 9mm handgun. Loki pistol whipped Nicky across the eye, causing it to burst open. He punched Nicky repeatedly in unleashed fury. The situation in Bridgeport declined rapidly. After the incident, Nicky took product from various connects and used their sales to pay back a large portion of his debt to Loki. Unfortunately, he would never be fully caught up. There were repeated problems at the house and an increase in violent crime in the neighborhood. Mike chose to leave Bridgeport for good. Now, without a large-scale supplier, he had to resort to buying drugs off the street, a position that would leave Mike extremely vulnerable to police. One night in December of 2006, Mike was picking up some heroin as usual. Together, he and 2 friends drove to Bridgeport and then returned to Milford. Once back in town, they pulled into a gas station to buy soda. Some nearby cops took notice. Unfortunately for Mike, these cops weren't any regular officers. They were part of Milford's narcotics squad. By 2007, Mike was a known drug dealer among Milford's police force. The narcotics team wouldn't let this opportunity slip them by. That night, Mike was formally charged with possession of narcotics and drug paraphernalia. Stashed in Mike's car, the narcotics team had found bags of heroin and a folded bill loaded with cocaine. A few months later, on March 7th, Mike officially became a convicted felon, guilty of possession of narcotics, and sentenced to 2 years of court-supervised probation. His life had completely spun out of control. 4 years had passed since he graduated high school. Mike's family had disowned him, but the thought of severe and excruciating withdrawal symptoms kept him an addict. Coincidentally, after his conviction, Mike began to hear stories of a clinic that prescribed a medication capable of reducing the pain from opioid withdrawal. This medication, a legal substance, helped people remain clean of illegal opioids. It sounded too good to be true. Deciding to check it out for himself, Mike checked into the clinic. For the next few months, a daily dose of controlled methadone sedated Mike's urges for illegal drugs. Now, he was no longer getting high off illegal drugs like heroin or cocaine. He was getting high off of legally administered methadone. It acted as a crutch for a while, but eventually just became another addiction. Like Mike, methadone patients often formed a dependency similar to the addictions they had from illegal substances. The clinic was essentially a state-authorized heroin dealer. Whether it was heroin, cocaine, or methadone, addicts would experience withdrawal symptoms if they abstained. It soon became pointless to stop. Mike began using all 3. Without a major supplier, by late 2007, Mike had been reduced to a street dealer addicted to both legal and illegal narcotics. For the next 2 years, he would wander between Milford and neighboring city New Haven, encountering a series of police run-ins, awry drug deals, and near homelessness. Things got worse in 2009. Yet another drug had infiltrated Milford, and Mike took his first hit of crack cocaine. From that point forward, Mike lost all control. He was a full-time addict, managing dependencies on 4 different drugs and alcohol. During that time, Mike's mom was not only grieving her son's drug addiction, but was also the sole caretaker for her father, who was in late-stage Parkinson's, cancer, and dementia. One day, out of sheer desperation, his mom asked if he could help her with Grandpa for a bit. Mike had nowhere else to go, so he agreed to temporarily stay with his grandpa to help out. Over there, he was responsible for handling basic duties related to his grandpa's care. He tried his best, but was still, first and foremost, a drug addict. One day, while his grandpa lay in bed, Mike snuck into the attic to smoke crack. This was the lowest point in Mike's life. Once it became clear to his mother that he couldn't balance caring for his grandfather and his drug addiction, Mike was back on the streets. This time, he was completely alone. Wasted days passed in a slow, excruciating blur. This was the endgame of the fast drug-dealing lifestyle he'd so desperately wanted just 5 years earlier. Just when all seemed lost, a flicker of hope appeared in early 2010. It came in the form of Mike's new tough love probation officer, Ellen. She was stern but compassionate. Her greatest strength was her ability to see through Mike's BS. Previous parole officers had let Mike off the hook, even after testing positive for illegal drugs. Mike would plead and make excuses. The officers always buckled. This time was different. Ellen called Mike after his latest court-mandated drug test and forced on him an ultimatum. Either go into a detox center or serve out your entire 5 years in prison. You have until 10 a.m. tomorrow to tell me your decision." Mike was stunned. The fear of severe withdrawal symptoms was real. He hesitated. But on June 18th, 2010, Mike finally made the decision that would turn his life around. As soon as his family found out, they came back into Mike's life. In the midst of confusion, pain, and fear, his family opened their arms in support. 4 days later, on June 22nd, 2010, Mike entered Southern Central Rehabilitation Center in New Haven, Connecticut. Over the next 5 days, Mike endured the gruesome pain and suffering of opioid withdrawal. He writhed in bed, moaning and bathed in sweat as his body spiked with fever. He vomited every few hours, retching in agony. He struggled to sleep. When he did doze off, the nightmares were scenes out of a horror movie. When he was released from the detox facility, it was as if he had just been on the front lines of a battle and survived. Ellen had only ordered Mike to go to detox and then maintain a drug-free lifestyle. Although she strongly urged him to admit himself to a long-term facility, she was unable to compel him into one. The doctors had warned Mike that the effects of years of opioid dependence would not disappear in a week, but rather would take months to fade away. It was time to grow up. 3 days after he left detox and 8 days clean of opioids, cocaine, alcohol, and Xanax, Mike decided to voluntarily enter a 45-day residential rehabilitation center in central Connecticut. When he arrived at the massive inpatient hospital, the reality of the situation began to sink in. A team of dedicated doctors, nurses, and counselors were there to help him through his recovery. Like most doctor visits, they first had to take his weight and blood pressure. Mike had always been a tall and lanky guy, but today he weighed 280 pounds and recorded dangerously high cholesterol levels. Years of drug use and physical neglect had caught up with him. He wheezed after walking up only a few stairs and felt fatigued and dizzy after minimal exercise. His teeth didn't fare much better either. Most of them now had cavities as a result of the methadone softening of teeth and bones. Some of them had decayed completely. At the rehab center, the main focus was on maintaining sobriety. It was structured like a military boot camp. Mike stayed with 3 other addicts in a small college-style dorm room. They were awakened at 6:30 every morning to clean their rooms and make their beds. They sat in giant circles and talked about ways they could battle their addictions once they got out of rehab. There were one-on-one sessions with counselors and doctors. He realized that everything that he'd been for the past 8 years was built on lies. After joining the general population of the facility, Mike found himself reverting to the class clown role he'd had his entire life. He loved any opportunity to make people laugh. Because of this, the counselors viewed him as someone who didn't take recovery seriously. They sneered at him, acting as if he wasn't someone worth investing in. Their doubt only made his determination stronger. At the final meeting with staff counselors and doctors, Mike spoke with Bernadette, the head of the rehab center. "We've seen people like you before," she said with a sneer. "You'll be back soon. You can be sure of that." She was the top figure in the facility. She was supposed to offer encouragement to Mike. Instead, she tried to undermine him. However, as negative as Bernadette's words were, no one could take away the profound feeling of clarity and determination Mike had built up in recovery. Still, this wasn't the end of the road. Mike was now 25 years old. He had no job, no real work experience, and no college degree. He was a convicted felon, and his credit was shot. He didn't even have a car. After he left rehab, Mike's mom allowed him to move back into her house. She looked forward to spending some time with her son again. Yet still, life was a battle. After pounding the pavement day after day, Mike's inability to find work lowered his confidence and battered self-esteem. Unfortunately, Mike's mother was going through struggles of her own. Her biggest supporter, her dad, was losing his battle against Parkinson's, cancer, and dementia. His condition had dramatically declined. One day, she got an idea for how to both help her recovering son and her ailing father. She saw that it was difficult for Mike to find a job. She also knew that it wasn't financially feasible to pay for a live-in nurse to stay with his aging grandfather. Killing two birds with one stone, Mike's mom asked him to move in with his grandfather to care for him full-time. With his own bedroom in the attic, Mike would feed his grandfather, administer his medication, take him to the bathroom, shower him, and dress him. Caring for his grandpa awakened Mike to what was important in life. He'd spent the last 8 years in reckless abandon. For the first time in a long time, Mike was happy to be alive. While his grandpa slept, Mike looked for jobs on the internet and new AA meetings to attend. However, his lack of transportation made it hard to get around. Without money, he couldn't get a car, so he resorted to cycling. At 280 pounds, it wasn't easy for Mike, but gradually he began to ride everywhere. He rode miles downtown to AA and NA meetings. By summer and early autumn, he was riding 20 miles a day. He fell so in love with cycling that even in the cold of January, he was still out on his bike. The new year, now 2011, would bring new hope, especially for Mike's professional life. After a chance run-in with an out-of-town blogger from New York, Mike's sales skills and ability to pitch himself shone through. On the spot, he was hired on to help build a local news site for Milford called Milford Patch. For most of 2011, he documented businesses, tasted food, and wrote restaurant reviews. He sat in local government meetings and reported on them. He attended charity events and interviewed sports teams. He learned to take photos, edit videos, and use social media. Mike's self-esteem skyrocketed, but as Mike's confidence increased, his grandpa's health worsened. Every day there was a new challenge, but Mike and his mother worked together to solve each problem as they arose. With warmer weather approaching, Mike had kept up with his cycling, and by June he was down to 230 pounds. Doing positive things started to feel natural. After a year of hard work, however, he began to walk a very thin line. It was right before summer, and Mike felt confident enough to go out to a few parties. He was certain his willpower was strong enough to withstand temptation. One night, against his better judgment, Mike took a shot of tequila. Instantly, he knew he'd done wrong. Despite the slip-up, his recovery progressed. It wasn't until 2012 that Mike would drop alcohol for good. But as Mike continued to recover, his grandfather did the opposite. In March of 2012, Mike's grandfather suffered from a dramatic blow in his ability to function. He began to refuse food and become despondent. Doctors and nurses were called in to perform tests. A month later, he died. Mike was overcome with regret that his addiction had kept him from his grandpa for so many years. Through assisting Grandpa, Mike discovered great value in helping others. He made the decision that, with any extra time he had, he would start giving back. Every summer, the Connecticut Challenge sponsored a cycling event to raise funds to benefit cancer survivors in the state. To take part in the 50-mile leg of the ride, participants were required to raise $750 for charity. For Mike, this ride was the perfect opportunity to give back while also doing what he loved. He would dedicate it to his grandfather. In July of 2012, he completed the 50-mile segment of the Connecticut Challenge. His father, mother, and two sisters all came to cheer him on. As he crossed the finish line, he thought of perseverance, of inner strength, but most of all, he thought of redemption. The next year, in 2013, Mike worked various jobs, writing for America Online, doing land surveys, and managing a dog camp. At this point, Mike had made a whole new set of friends in Milford. They were different from his old friends. They wanted to win in life. One of Mike's new friends was a guy named Pat. Between 2014 and 2015, Pat and Mike explored innumerable business ideas, from real estate to stock trading to blogging. One day, Mike saw a Craigslist ad that made him sit up and take notice. A brand founder was looking for a social media expert who could help blow up his personal following. Mike responded with a bunch of exaggerated stuff about his brief time writing for America Online. He Googled brand speak and terms like brand awareness, cost per click, and other marketing terminology he didn't fully understand. One day, Pat and Mike had just finished a rough day of day trading penny stocks and decided to grab a bite to eat at Subway. While munching away, Mike got a phone call. "This is Sean Nelson," the man said. "I'm the CEO at Lovesac in Stamford. You responded to my Craigslist ad last week. I was hoping we could chat next week at my office." "I'm free all week, man," Mike said. "I can work around your schedule." "Perfect, brother," Sean said. "See you Tuesday for lunch. Pumped for this." When Mike got home, he did some research and realized how big of a break this opportunity was. Sean Nelson had been building the Lovesac brand since 1996. He started out making the world's largest beanbag chairs in Utah. By 2015, they were owned by celebrities and trendsetters across the country. From Jamie Foxx to Rob Dyrdek to Outkast, Lovesac operated in 50 stores nationwide and grossed approximately $50 million in annual revenue. The company was in an aggressive growth phase, and its CEO needed someone to manage his own personal brand and do PR. The following Tuesday, Mike drove his old Chevy to the interview. They spoke for 2 hours and finished the interview at Lovesac headquarters. From the moment he walked in, Mike knew he'd found a home. Still, he was filled with doubts after the interview. The workers he'd seen at Lovesac were all people who looked like they had their stuff together. College degrees, new clothes, and 401ks. A week later, his doubts would be put to rest. What happened next would give Mike a platform for the rest of his life. After starting as Sean's personal PR specialist and social manager, Mike quickly proved himself. He built out his social media calendars, responded to celebrities who tweeted at him, and worked on getting Sean featured on news shows or in articles. He quickly moved up to marketing manager and organized viral videos for the brand that would gain over 500 million views across social media. Quickly, Mike built a reputation for himself as a premier social media and brand manager. Soon, Sean trusted Mike enough to take him on business trips. Outside of Connecticut, Mike had only ever been to Orlando and Vermont. This was a dream come true. In October 2015, Mike got his first taste of Los Angeles. From cycling down Venice, to surfing in Huntington Beach, to driving along the Pacific Coast Highway, Mike took it all in. As he boarded his return flight to Connecticut from LAX, Mike realized he never wanted to leave. LA was where he belonged. Still, he had responsibilities back in Connecticut. One day, while working at Lovesac HQ, Mike got a text from an unknown number. "Ayo, is this Mike?" "Yes, who is this?" "I got your number from a friend. My name is Logan Paul. What's the deal with these Lovesacs, man? Can you f*** on them?" Despite his new corporate position, Mike took a risk. Yeah, the covers are machine washable, so the cum washes right out, haha. Years later, Logan would tell media outlets that the reason he became friends with Mike was because of how he responded in that first text exchange. That little bit of risk secured a relationship that would help build a successful business partnership and an enduring friendship. Later on in the text exchange, Mike offered to send Logan 3 Lovesac chairs in exchange for a post on his Instagram and Twitter accounts. Logan's fees were usually much higher, but since he loved the product and liked Mike's vibe, he'd post the one time in exchange for the chairs. A month later, everything changed. On a Sunday afternoon, Lovesac's website began to crash. Logan had just posted about Lovesac on his social media, and website visitors were pouring in by record numbers. From here, Mike's reputation in the social media world began to rise. His phone was filled with text messages from Logan's friends like King Bach and Amanda Cerny. Over the next 4 years, those early relationships snowballed into influencer marketing projects that drove millions of visitors to the Lovesac homepage. Mike's efforts as marketing manager were analyzed in case studies, panels, and magazine articles. His natural ability to befriend others became a cornerstone of his success. Later that year, in 2016, Mike would finally meet Logan in person for a promotional shoot. They clicked instantly. Continuing on into 2017, the two continued to collaborate with each other on a number of projects. He even began to appear in Logan's vlogs. By the year's end, Mike was bi-coastal, traveling back and forth between California and Connecticut. Then, in 2018, disaster struck for Logan Paul. In an attempt to shock the audience to drive more views, he had made an extremely poor decision. He had gone too far. He'd made a mistake. As someone no stranger to mistakes himself, Mike empathized. Still, he felt angry at the situation. Of course, Logan was at fault for posting the video on his channel, but Mike's background in the brand world had taught him that there should have been layers of review first. That is standard operating procedure for brands that generate millions of dollars of revenue a year, as Logan Paul was. The scandal immediately revealed to Mike that Logan, while young, reckless, and hard-headed, was also being mismanaged by his current team. Over the next week, Mike sat with Logan and offered advice on his business structure and the way he saw the Maverick brand being run and managed. Together, Logan and Mike hammered out a working structure on how Team Maverick would handle the scandals moving forward. That trust became the bedrock for their current working relationship. Over the course of 2018, Logan, his team, and Mike worked diligently to repair his image and rebuild the struggling Maverick brand. They worked through months of infighting between parents, management, lawyers, investors, and accountants. The effects of Mike's advisory began to show. Every piece of content that went out, no matter how big or small, would be reviewed by a multiple-person team to ensure its appropriateness for public consumption. People who were toxic to the business were pushed to the sidelines. By September 2018, Mike had become an integral part of Logan's business while still working full-time at Lovesac. It was time for one last change, one final move for Mike. Mike's departure from Lovesac was bittersweet. Lovesac and Sean had done so much for Mike, but it was time to move on. In November 2018, Mike made the move to LA and joined Logan's team full-time. And as for the rest of the story, well, you know the rest.